I have a congenital heart condition. And so I've actually had open heart surgery now 2 times, and I've had a valve replacement 3 times. And my first surgery was when I was 3, right? So I was mini. And then my mom always told me, you're fine for the rest of your life. That was the message I always got. Daniel, you know this story. But then in 2015, I went in for a regular checkup, and the cardiologist was like, Nate, we have an issue. You actually need open heart surgery, and you need it like yesterday. And so there I was. We were 5 years into the factory, and we had just begun to develop team kinda. And we had just begun to delegate in some ways. But that was my equivalent of being forced to let go, because I went off the grid for a solid 2 months. Like there was no Nate, and what was fascinating was I can vividly remember meeting with the team, with all the teachers, plus our like 1 or 2 staff, and being like, so I have some news, and I trust you all, and I really appreciate you giving me the space and time to heal. And it was powerful, Alyssa, because I came back 2 months later, and actually the business had grown like 5%.
No, that's amazing.
And it was like, I'm telling you, Alyssa, I was like, if you want to develop faith in delegation and begin, like, I didn't know how not to micromanage at that point. I just didn't even have a choice not to micromanage. But that's like we obviously, I don't wish any one of our listeners that type of medical emergency that requires you to delegate and let go. But we all actually do have very personal versions of this that resonate for us.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. We've got a good one again today. We brought Alyssa back to talk about a topic that I don't know how we haven't talked about this on the podcast to date, but we want to talk about the dark side of scaling, some of the bad habits that owners can fall into while scaling their studio or their school up to a larger size. And so we're going to talk about topics of micromanagement, delegation, overwhelm, things of that nature. And we're going to do it the way we did the last time. The last time we had Alyssa on, we talked about managing a crisis, or managing through a crisis, rather. And we kind of took this roundtable format where we each shared a story of this crucible moment in the history of our business. And I think we're going to do that again today. We're going to talk about our own experiences with scaling up. So I'm ready to get into it. How about you all?
Yeah, let's do it.
Welcome back, Alyssa. So glad you're here on the pod.
Excited to be here.
Cool. Well, I want to start this time with Nate. Last time we started the roundtable with me. Nate, I want to start with you. And I'm sure you have tons and tons of stories to tell. Maybe we should, however, start, before we even get into that, maybe let's just create a working definition of what we think micromanagement is, or what we think delegation is. I think I think we at least need to define terms before we jump into talking about it for the next hour.
Totally. So in my experience here at Brooklyn Music Factory, delegation basically I define as when I take something that lived only in my to-do and I've decided someone else is qualified to do it. Oftentimes, when we first start testing out delegation, and this absolutely happened for my partner Pira and myself here at the factory, what we're really saying is we can't stand what's on our list. We just wish someone else would do it, but we're so opinionated on the outcome and how exactly that person's supposed to get to success that we're just going to continue to watch over their shoulder at every step of the task until the thing is done to our liking. And so micromanagement, actually, when we fail at delegation, what we're actually creating is like really 5x the amount of work we originally had if we were just willing to do it ourselves. I'm curious if anybody else would like to add to my definition of micromanagement.
Yeah. Alyssa, I'd be curious, like, if you have anything to add on delegation and micromanagement before we could jump into it.
I love, like, Nate, as you were saying, your definition of, yeah, it's like when you're ready to give something to someone, and then micromanagement is a line where we think we're ready, but we're not quite ready. And we like almost, try to kind of keep the role, but quasi have it with someone else. I would say delegation is an act of trust. And that's going to be a lot of what I talk about with, my own story, but I can't agree with Nate more. I think that that's the best way to put it. It's a quick way to 5 times your own workload. What about you, Daniel? Do you have anything else that you'd add to it?
There's one thing I'm going to add. I'm going to set a ground rule for the whole discussion. And then there is one thing I want to bring up that has nothing to do with this right before I turn it back over to Nate. Here's the ground rule I want to lay down, because I have heard ad nauseum throughout my career what I'll call cliche around delegation, which is there's just this cliche, and I think it persists because marketers are lazy and they just latch onto the cliche, and then they've used it so much that now people just use that language kind of thoughtlessly. And it's that, oh, business owners are scared to delegate. They're afraid to hand things off to other people. And then I think over time, as marketers in trying to sell a solution to that fear, in talking about it so much, I think that language has just been picked up by small business owners and has actually been memed into existence almost. And so the ground rule I want to lay is I want to move past that cliche and actually get into specificity. Now, I mean, if either of you had that fear, like you truly and genuinely were afraid to delegate, let's just get into the specific of what that was. But I don't want to just park at that level and talk about that for 25 minutes, because that's just been done ad nauseum, since podcasts began existing. I want to actually provide something of a little more value to the audience. That's the first thing. The second thing that's completely unrelated is I do just want to mention that we are 2 days away from the Founders Forum beginning. And if you want more information about that, we've been talking about it all through the month of October, but if you want more information about that, go over to growingmusicstudio.com/forum. And if you're listening to this episode in the future and you're like, oh man, I missed it. I missed it. This was last year. Still go to that link and find out how you might participate in a future year or in a future class that we're running. But the forum, of course, is what we've been talking about for months now, where Nate and I are going to be taking a group of owners through Brooklyn Music Factory's systems, including systems that they used around delegation. I'm going to be teaching my delegation system, tools that we use to hand things off, and things of that nature. And this is all going to be done in the context of a collaborative group of owners, which we already have a lot of commitments to this. There's just some powerful, powerful people going to be involved in this thing. So don't miss that. All right. Having said that, Nate, let's start with a question. Ready?
Yo, I'm always ready for a good question. Tee it up.
Cool. So my question for you is, when did you make the conscious choice to scale with team? I think that's a good inroad into the delegation discussion.
Yeah, it's such a good one, because rather than give a date or time or stage of evolution at Brooklyn Music Factory, I think it's much more important. The way I answered it in my head was, when did I know it was time to trust someone else with major facets of the business? Before I give my specific answer, I want to just reframe what you said around that sort of the surface level, shallow hole that everyone starts and ends with around delegation of, I'm just afraid to delegate. And what I'd rather people do is go into their journal and contemplate what Alyssa opened with, which was this idea of trust. And instead of ask yourself, am I afraid to delegate? Ask yourself the question, where do I lack trust in my life? Forget work. Just literally be like, who do I put my trust in, and why, and how did I get there? And where in my life do I still feel like I'm the only solution? And I can't trust someone else, right? Because I just love what you said, Alyssa, around trust. And as as the three of us know, like, our music schools or our small businesses, they're not a reflection of purely of business craft. They're a reflection of how we live our life. So that's just a micro reframe there That's more of like a 3 to 6 month journaling project. So don't think you're doing this weekend, but get started on it this weekend.
Yeah. And I would also say, Nate, too, that it's especially the case when we start to bring up relationships within a business, right? Because this is interpersonal now needs for the business to succeed. And so everything that we are as a person, the way we come to relationships is going to mirror, especially within the context of team.
Yeah. I'm going to quote someone from our recent training day we did at the factory because it's just popping into my head. This is an amazing member of our teaching staff who also is sort of our point person for the facility. And we're a 9 studio school plus like a 70 seat performance space. And we do this process, Alyssa, Daniel, called setting our intentions. And we have a Slack channel that's just called intentions. And one of the most powerful parts of it is going back a year or 2 years to look at what each one of the team members said was their intention around different facets of being a member of this community. And I said in my intention, and we sort of read each other's intentions, and then you have to pick somebody else's intention and share why it was powerful for you. And in my intention, in my current role, as we know, and we talk about this on this pod all the time, my intention set was like, I want to be of benefit to everyone on this team in a very specific and action-oriented way each week. And one way I can measure success is, did I ask at least one team member how I could help them? Just wide open question, right? So it sounds pretty simple, but it's hard to do as a founder or as an owner to remember to do that, right? And Dan brings up in the intention, he's like, I want to cite Nate's intention because I think one of Nate's strengths is that he finds where each one of us are going to live our like best version of self at the factory. And I just want to say out loud that he's given me roles here where I really feel like I can succeed. And so I'm fast forwarding on the delegation piece, but it really warmed my heart because I promise you, like 10 years ago, like I was giving people projects just because I needed them off my list. Right. So I just want to I'm fast forwarding in our pod, but it struck me around your idea of building relationships. Of course, people begin to trust us as delegators when they feel like they're being sort of asked to live out their full potential. I knew that I needed to hand off what our space could look and feel like to somebody else.
Nate, it strikes me that you started in your career of delegation with
yeah, it's never ending.
That's really all we are as scalers of business, as career delegationers. But I feel like it strikes me, what's interesting is you kind of went this route of giving very specific actionable projects that have like a very clear start and end date to people as your very first points of experience with delegation. And I find that to be interesting for the reason that I think that's a terrific way for our listeners who are considering delegating for the first time to try this out. Because often with specific projects that have a start and end time that are not like ad infinity or super complex or have a lot of like tangly roots to untie, it can be a really great way to start to build that confidence, not only in someone else showing up and doing the tasks, but also in getting experience managing that and understanding how to move a project forward, right? So I think that that's so cool. And also what's fascinating to me is I never knew that you and Daniel's, and maybe Daniel, I don't know if this is true for you, but the way Nate said it made me feel as if you guys shared this in common, is that the first hire or outsourcing that you did or delegation that you did was for someone within finance, because I actually didn't do that until much later. I mean, we all know my story. I told you I signed a $10,000 a month lease without knowing what I was making every month, right? So I think that I did it in a very different way. I started with outsourcing to a teacher or an administrative assistant. So this is going to be so fun to dive into this a bit more with you and see, the method of your madness. Why did you start with those roles? I guess I wanted to just ask that. Why did you start with those specific things outside of it just being a good need for the business? were you consciously thinking like, this is a great way to practice, or was it something different?
Not consciously aware that this was a great way to practice, because that would be giving me way too much credit
Too much
2 years
credit.
into the growth of a business. More like consciously aware of where I was dropping the ball consistently.
Ooh.
So that's a short answer to that. In addition, I was absolutely getting help at this point. I was taking like a local small business class that New York City offered for free, or like on a sliding scale. And I had gone through like a 3 or 4 week finance module. And yeah, it was just a zinger of a module for me, because I knew I was interested in numbers at then. I knew I wanted to build spreadsheets. I knew I wanted to figure out what to do with all the numbers in spreadsheets, but I knew I wasn't good at keeping them clean, if that makes sense. So that's the part where I kept dropping the ball on just showing up Monday through Friday and reconciling and keeping everything clean. But I could always see from 10,000 feet the benefit of being able to look at a clean set of books every week or every month. So I would say, if the ball keeps dropping, if you're the one who keeps double dribbling and getting called on it, then you probably know you need some help. And it's a good place to start to delegate. Can I add one other thing, Alyssa? And we'll get more into this as we hear your stories, you and Daniel, on it. But I believe project-based delegation was valuable for me, because I'd start by actually being able to wrap my arms around the project a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like I wanted Kai to take over all automation and I was just espousing what I heard were best practices. I'd actually been in the tool, gone to conferences, been studying, doing these 3-day automation retreats by myself, where I would JOMO and block book 6 hours a day just to build campaigns. And so that I had wrapped my arm around the thing enough to be like, this is what it looks and feels like when you're kind of in the flow of doing it.
And would you recommend, Nate and Daniel, would you guys recommend for our listeners that, as a rule of thumb, before delegating, that they should have done the thing that they're delegating beforehand, or that they should have a reasonable or minimal amount of knowledge around it? Like, what would you guys recommend? I think that this is an important thing.
I'll jump in on this one and say that in some cases I think it's complicated. I think in some cases it makes sense, but in other cases, I didn't want to have to learn how to do certain things. I just needed someone else to do them. I think the finance piece is actually a perfect example of that. Like, I don't need an accounting. I don't need to be an accountant. I don't need to learn to become an accountant. And I'll even just add this in to echo off something you said 5 minutes ago that I really wanted to jump in on, that you said, Alyssa. You were just kind of pointing out how Nate started chipping things off around the edge and farming them out to other people. And I just want to make a further case for this. I'm actually working with a client right now who is actually pretty good at keeping track of the finances. They actually have some training in it. And I've had to say to them, no, you need to let that go. This is not worth your time. Spend the $200 a month to get a bookkeeper to give you a really clean P&L. Take that back, that time, put it to something else. And when we kind of get around the table to me, there's some things I want to even go in deeper on that concept, but I think there's value in handing off things that you've never personally done. I think there's also value in handing off things that you're already really good at and you should just get rid of, because if it is that clean of a cut, as Nate is saying, it's just such a clearly defined project. Yeah, let that thing go.
That's great, because one of the biggest, I'm sure you guys get this within coaching, and I get it too from so many of our clients. It's like a lot of the top 2 questions are like, what should I delegate first?
Yes.
Right? That's like a big one. People are very confused over. They want to start to try to dabble with it, but they just don't know, like, what is the first thing I should begin with? And so I think this is a really interesting conversation to hear, how you guys have chosen to begin your delegation career, as we've been putting it.
Yeah. Okay. So we are 20 minutes of this podcast and we have asked one of 15 questions. So I think we need to move on. Has there been a point that you've identified? Has there been a time you identified where you actually did struggle with some aspect of either delegating things out or micromanaging people? I'm just curious what your thought would be around that and what you've learned from it.
Yes. I'm going to come up with a concrete story. It might be later in the pod, but I'm going to say this. There are best practices for doing every facet of our small business, from bucket number 1, marketing sales, to delivering on promise, the curriculum, all that stuff, to the systems in bucket 3, and then finally when you're introducing new business. And I know this about myself, Daniel, we get very interested in certain facets within each bucket. And that's where we have to be the most careful, right? Because where we have the most interest, back to your client who's quite good at doing finances, and maybe they're the bookkeeper at home and they did it in a previous business. And so they've always been interested. The outcome is not going to look and feel exactly the way you did it, right? So when you're delegating, yes, you can have a great working procedure and you can say, this is what it looks and feels like. But the power of delegation is in that, first of all, you're multiplying yourself and your own interests by bringing on other people. But the power is that they may come up with a much better system, and it'll actually inspire you to make even stronger choices in your business than when you were married to the thing, right? So where I've failed in this has been when I've insisted that it need to look and feel like Nate's version. So a perfect example, I've come up with my story. As you know, Jessica, who's not only my wife of 26 years, but also the director of families and communication at the factory here, she handles most of our enrollment. She handles a solid 50% of our enrollment. And then we have 2 other people on the sales team. Now, she oftentimes says, like, I hate taking sales calls when you're around because I think you're listening. And basically that's code for, I think you're going to manage my sales process. You dig? And like when it comes from your spouse and partner, it's
right.
You're like, whoa, be real careful, because we all know we cannot micromanage our partners or our friends. That is a recipe for disaster in developing a deep, trusting relationship. So that's how I failed when, for example, I would hand off systems for, a perfect example would be like, hey, I want the studio to look and feel like this with equipment in arm's reach and everything. And I hand it off and it doesn't get done as fast as I need it to get done. Or maybe the first version isn't exactly the way I imagined it. Right. And so I fail because what I want is it to be done on my timeline. But what I'm doing is I'm essentially undercutting them. And I'm not giving them the time to understand my vision, then make it their own, and then implement it. And then when they implement it, because of course success doesn't come like week 1 or even month 1 with delegation. Success comes when you look back 6 months from now, Daniel, and you're like, wow, A, I can't believe I used to do this. B, this is so badass the solution they ended up with. That's my answer on that.
Nice. I guess this might be a good place then to switch into really the final question I had, which is that if there is if there's one thing you could teach those who are listening right now or who are watching on YouTube, what lesson would you give to folks? And it might just be an extension of what you just said there, but what's that most important thing you've learned or the most important thing you would pass on to others?
Okay, I'm going to reframe it because basically 95% of our listeners were once teachers or continue to teach. And so I'm going to reframe delegation like this. You see yourself as a success in the classroom. I'm literally sitting in the classroom where I'm going to see Andy Tinio for his lesson in about 6 hours. I have a vision for what I want Andy Tinio to get out of the 45 minutes, and then how he's going to be transformed and come back and bring something that's inspiring back a week later to this room. So the way I would reframe it for all of our listeners is you are already awesome and visionary at teaching. It just happens to be music. So now you need to imagine what goes into successful teaching for other facets of the business. So one of the key lessons that I've learned is when delegating, it can be anything from like a website update, how to track your QR code and tag leads, to what we do to create an inspiring, in our case, community room. I could be training on anything, right? Because that's actually what we're doing in delegation. Just apply the same version of yourself. If you're super funny and you bounce around and you're great in the classroom and that's how you operate, then be the exact same version of yourself in training when delegating. Just make that video of updating the website and be like, okay, so step number 1. Now, most of us will totally screw this up because I totally did, but here's what we're going to do, and da-da-da-da-da, and that's your training video. It doesn't need to look at all like your Work the Systems book, which is what I bought, which was super dry. It can just look and feel exactly the way your school operates already when you're inspiring your teachers or your students. That's the hard lesson that it took me a while to learn, which is like, if you want success with your student, you're detailed, you're thorough, you're engaging. Mm-hmm. Do the exact same thing with your website updates or your CRM campaign builds or whatever it is you're handing off.
Wow. That's such an interesting analogy too, Nate, of thinking about delegation as an opportunity to expand our teaching to other facets of our business. So we just show up essentially as the teachers we are with students, clients, and with that same amount of patience, understanding, compassion, step-by-step scaffolding and approaching to it, right? And we all know as teachers that it's a collaboration, right? It's a collaboration with our student. We are open to learning from them as much as we are to teaching them, right? So if we're a good teacher anyway. So I think it's amazing to me also, like how I feel a similar struggle to you, which is like, there was just like this huge disconnect when I first started hiring. And for other aspects of the business, it's like that version of Alyssa or that version of her inner teacher just like went away. It was like completely non-existent when actually like I felt like it had to be this totally different person or this totally different approach. And the way I showed up for those initial hires was completely against who I was showing up as a teacher for my, at the time, piano students. So it's really interesting. That analogy is such an interesting analogy to tap into.
Alyssa, imagine with your student, imagine your adult student you're going to see this week. If she came back and could not perform at the level that you imagined based on last week's lesson, like, would you just immediately be like, wrong delegation, you're fired. You know, hell no. You'd be like, oh, actually, my lesson plan needs improvement.
Yeah, right. Right. I would be like, you know, you idiots, you know.
Yeah, right. You're fired. You're fired.
Oh, God. Wow, what a time. Watch your cats and dogs.
This episode is sponsored by GroupLessons.com. If you're looking for a group piano method that is easy to implement in your studio or school, look no farther than Piano Express from GroupLessons.com. Because unlike most group piano methods, Piano Express allows students to make individual progress within the context of a larger group. And because of the at-home practice tools and gamified curriculum, students using the Piano Express method make faster progress than the average method book student. And that helps students feel excited, accomplished, and motivated to learn new music. Also, the system is really adaptable. We've got teachers using the system in their home studios, and we have many large commercial studios running our 3-room model that allows you to see up to 24 students per hour with just 2 teachers. So if you'd like to learn more about Piano Express, navigate to grouplessons.com and sign up for a free demo. You'll get to look at the method, our app and teacher guides, and we'll even give you a sneak peek of our implementation plan that has helped hundreds of studios start their group program in just a few weeks. So let's bump over to you, Alyssa. I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Nate, and ask, when did you make the conscious decision to scale with team? Because, you know, on the last podcast, you really gave, or on a lot of the previous podcasts you've been on, you've given like a really detailed history of kind of Musicians Playground's history and some of the trials and tribulations you've been through, it'd be interesting to know where in that story, you decided to start delegating and what that looked like for you. Because I know it's going to have been different than Nate's.
Yeah, for sure. So I had always dreamed of having a multi-location studio and a facility that was more of a destination for a variety of music lovers. So I say that because some of our listeners may not be sure about their vision for their studio quite yet. Do they want to expand to a commercial location? Do they want to have multiple locations? Do they want to keep this as a solo kind of venture and just be the only teacher? Do they want to continue to teach out of their home? So we have a lot of different listeners. And I think it's important to frame this around vision of a company because, sometimes we don't have to go as far as delegating a whole lot of things if our vision doesn't entail that. But for me, I knew I was going to have to cozy up to being okay with other people teaching because I wasn't going to teach hundreds and hundreds of people on my own. I didn't have a way forward without their help to do that. So I decided, to start with hiring a teacher. And my first hire was another piano teacher to help support in the teaching of the students that I had in my studio. A lot of my logic at that time was, hey, I'm a professional teacher of piano and I know a lot about this. So I feel like I'm going to be able to know if this person's doing a good or bad job, right? So I kind of went in a different direction than Nate, and I started in a different kind of way than Nate. But I do think looking back, it's kind of hilarious. I can remember, so I had this like brick and beam loft where it was like a live work kind of space that I was operating out of at the time. We all know I was not quite I was living in the closet. I was kind of living in tight quarters there at that time. It was about 2014 or 15 at this time. And I can remember his name was Matt, bless his soul. I'm just so thankful for who Matt was as a person. He's very patient. And I would hide behind the beams in my loft, like looking around the beam to see like, how is he doing? How is he teaching? How is the lesson going? I mean, talk about micromanagement. I was like in the corner, literally spying on him. And I'm sure that he knew this. Or I'd pretend to sit at my desk doing busy work while the families were there working with him. And I would be like this, like just staring, over at him at the piano while typing at the computer. It was quite clear I was way up in his business and I did not trust him at all. And so as much as I would have wished that looking back, I could have given him some more freedom. I could have been a bit more open to his, as Nate called it, unique vision. I was a control freak. I mean, I still kind of am. I'm doing work on it, right? So I think our inner control freak is really, Daniel, per your point earlier, like talk about going a layer deeper. Our inner control freak is really the one who's getting the most challenged by delegation, and then what's most flaring up, if you will, when we become micromanagers, right? So our need for control, if we can let go of some control, and that requires trust, then we can open up to possibilities. And like Nate said, we could maybe be surprised by the output of that. So that's my first example of hiring. And I'm happy to say that, I'm sure some of our listeners are also mothers or fathers, right? You have your first child and we're all like super control freaks. I don't have children yet, but I can imagine, right? We're doing all the things to take care of that child, make sure nothing, no one can touch it. Can't go near an outlet, right? By like the fifth child, you have children that are like pretty much sticking their finger in the outlet and you're like, they'll be all right. No problem. They're fine, right? And so I think a lot of our journey, my journey at least as a manager, as a leader, has become that of like a parent. By like our hires now, I'm just like, yeah, cool, they've got it. Like I need to remind myself to check in with them and make sure like all is well, right? Because I just have like this implicit trust now. And I also will say it's come with more intensive hiring practice and more experience of knowing who I need to be looking for to have that trust, right? But I can say it's a lot like mothering or fathering. We kind of get used to it the more we do it, and we relax into the process. We trust our inner control freak can take like a little bit of a break the more we practice this kind of thing. So
I feel like in Brooklyn, New York, we're at the epicenter of what used to be called helicopter parenting and is now called snowplow parenting, where we're basically trying to get everything out of the way of our children from succeeding. And as parents, it's such a good analogy. Like you were a helicopter parent to your first teacher, and then maybe even a snowplow parent. Like, let me just come quickly teach that. I got this. Let me just take care of that for you. You just have a seat and watch me.
yeah,
You know?
yeah, exactly.
Which is so good. I just wrote something down on my board, and then back to you, Daniel. These three things, which we've heard this time and time again, but I feel like it's worth repeating. If we don't trust an employee or a teacher, then we have to ask ourselves one of these three questions. Is there a clear definition for the teacher or the staff member of what success looks like? Does that teacher clearly know if she's guiding that student to a finish line that's been defined? And then secondly, do they actually have the tools to succeed if they know what success looks like? Like some of the most basic things we forget to do with our teachers is say, the date of the gig or the recital is January 28th. You have 4 months to get your student to January 28th. Like they don't even know the date yet. Like we fail with some really basic things. And then finally, are they getting consistent feedback? It's like one of those three things. You're probably missing one of those three or all three if you're early on in your journey building your multi-teacher studio if you're lacking trust in your teachers.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, Nate, for folks who are beginning their delegating journey to come within and say when there is a point of failure to have the immediate reaction, just train themselves to have that immediate reaction of how have I not done something to empower this person to succeed. So that would be a great moment for them to reflect on that list of three questions there to see where was the breakdown that we are responsible for in that outcome, right? And I think a lot of times we hire with this expectation, a false expectation that one, people can read our minds, and two, that they're just going to be the most professional, amazing people to do the project and in the way that we perceive amazingness and perfection. And so I think that that's kind of an expectation we go into. And then when it comes back in a way that we're not anticipating, it will come back as we get upset and we think, this person doesn't know what they're doing. They're a terrible employee or they're a terrible hire or the project better end. We're very ultimatist in the way we think, right? And the way we react versus kind of coming at this, more curiosity. In what way did this become this outcome? How did I contribute to this? And what's needed to get this project in the direction that I was hoping it would be going in, right? And kind of assuming that this is going to be a series of steps versus perfect on the first go. So I do think that that's, and it's a shift of kind of paradigm or expectation as we begin hiring that we're not going to have that. We're not going to have people that get it on the first go.
You didn't disappoint, Alyssa, because in telling your story, you did what I've come to expect from you, which is you really focus in on that inward part of entrepreneurship and ownership. So I'm wondering what it was that you did or the tools that you used or how did you get to the place that you're at now? How did you overcome that inner temptation to be the helicopter mom of the studio? You know what I mean?
I think some of my staff listening might be like, she hasn't. Oh, goodness. So I really, truly stand by practice and just continuing to try. And I think I've always been somebody who's been open to feedback. And that was a really big ally in my growth in this because, maybe it's feedback like someone quitting, or maybe it's feedback like someone being frustrated or maybe it's someone crying because they're not doing a project correctly, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that along the way has taught me, maybe I'm being somebody that's not helping the situation or this person. And maybe I could be different. Maybe I could try showing up differently to support a different outcome here. And I think there's just this level of kind of curiosity and self-questioning and reflection that we have to bring as managers, as leaders, because every person's also going to be different that we hire, right? So we just kind of have to treat these like the complexity that relationships are in both our personal and professional life. Like, hey, I want to be willing to make this work with somebody. And to do that, we have to understand that it like takes two to tango, right? And so I think, just to answer your question, Daniel, staying open to growth, being personally curious, self-reflective, and understanding that, I need to practice, but everybody's going to be different, and trying to tap into different ways I could show up until I found kind of that way that worked, that way that I felt most comfortable and that I felt was bringing the most results with everybody I've employed. And I think just, ultimately, like I said, the sheer numbers, like at some point, I always tell this story. Like I went rock climbing one time. I don't know if you guys have done like inner rock climbing, like the walls.
Yeah.
I was afraid. I promise this relates to what we're talking about. I was afraid to jump off and let the harness take me down.
Yeah.
So I would climb all the way back down the walls. I was getting so fatigued. My friends were like moving on to the walls, the more advanced walls. And my wrists were going to fall off. And eventually I'm at the top of one of the more advanced walls. And I literally could not hang on anymore. Like my wrist gave up. And I just shot back and fell down, right? Using the harness. I didn't want to use the harness. I wanted to climb back down. But I think the analogy to delegation and what your question is like, sometimes we have so much on our plate that you end up just falling off the wall, and like you have to trust the person because you don't have any extra bandwidth to be like micromanaging anymore because the growth of your business requires that. So it's like almost not even a choice. Sometimes you have to because you're just so tired. Your wrists, quote unquote, give up as a business owner. And I think with that, then I was pleasantly surprised. Of course, I landed on the ground safely with the harness. And as we do with the delegation, when you're forced to delegate and then you can't micromanage because of circumstances, you see, oh my God, nothing burned down. Like, this is cool. Like, I'm all right. We're all right. Everything's good. And now I'm going to try this again because I really like having the support of that harness. Make sense?
Yes. Okay. You have said something here that I really want to jump in on and build something on for people. But first, I want to say that, yes, I do understand what you mean because I've done that before. And one of the things at the climbing gym that I went to, because these walls were like 60 feet high, and as you got the more advanced ones, they had like a very aggressive angle, Anyway, one of the things they did was your safety spotter, you'd go about 10 feet up the wall, and they'd say, hey, just let go and jump back. And he would prove to you that he would catch you. Anyway, I just want to mention that. I don't know if they did that for you. Did they do that for you?
Obviously not.
Okay. So that was the way that they built trust, and I don't know if there's an analogy to business. I just thought that I would say that. But here's the point I really want to make. Sometimes when people ask me, who should I hire next? Like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, or in that episode we did, Nate, the order of hiring, we did a while back. People are almost trying to force scale. It's almost like they're trying to force the hire.
Yeah.
Here's the best way. Here's the best way to put yourself in the position where you are forced to delegate, like Alyssa just said. And it's going to feel like I'm going off topic, but organic growth is the best way to organically grow your business. And I know that sounds really like almost too simple to be useful. But what I'm saying is that instead of forcing all these structures in your business, start with your marketing bucket first. It's why it's bucket number one. Build your systems out there. Put a lot of your effort there. If you do not have an absolute flood of leads coming all the time, keep working on that system until you do. And then what happens is your school grows organically and you're put into positions where you're no longer allowed to wring your hands and overthink about how the proper way to delegate or should I give this to a person or not. You will beg people to take things off your plate. This is really the way to go about it. And honestly, it is the way that it worked for me in Grow Your Music Studio. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit for Grow and for my own personal, music business. But I just think what you said there was such a tee up for that concept, because that's a concept I think a lot that we don't talk about a lot in the podcast. And I also don't think it's something that's talked about at all in general in our circles in this music industry. So anyway, I just want to take that opportunity because your concept was so good there. And maybe the thing that I would have you end your section of the roundtable on would just be if you could give someone a concrete, practical piece of advice or coaching or something you've learned that would be valuable to those who are listening to this conversation right now. Like, what would that one thing be? I know there's probably a lot of things, but like, what would that one thing be? The takeaway for you to them?
Get a therapist.
Please elaborate.
Yep.
No, she's like, no, that's just the advice. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Oh my goodness. Let me think here. So,
I'm sending this to all my friends. This is like the best episode ever.
Yeah,
Daniel, what do you do? Just watch this episode. We just goof around all the time when we get on the podcast. Go ahead.
Exactly. Oh man. Okay. So, okay. Practical things. So I really think Nate's 3 questions earlier are so super impractical. So first, I'll just echo that if listeners could write those down, put them somewhere they can reference them super easily, and be sure to ask themselves questions along those lines every single time they're confronted with maybe the desire to delegate or a challenge with delegation or micromanagement, right? I think that's great. That's practical. A second thing I would say is that a lot of, as we've talked about on the podcast, a lot of issues with the delegation / micromanagement come from our internal issues and or interpersonal issues and themes that we've dealt with interpersonally. So I do think, and I know that this is, at the risk of moving away from business, but for me personally, having a therapist or a life coach or someone that I could have as a mirror to myself who knew me very deeply and who could pick up on these things from a professional background was really helpful. And then pairing that with kind of books on the things I was struggling with has also been a really, really good thing. So there's a lot of books out there. Maybe we could put a list or something out for readers to consider. But I'd say any books along the lines of interpersonal relationships, believe it or not, like love relationships, this stuff can work really well for knowing how to show up for employees. Being a good communicator or listener, management books, leadership books, books on like candor, radical candor, right? These are all really good things to be reading, to be absorbing, to be continuously expanding your own thoughts and behaviors with. So I'd say that those are my practical suggestions.
Boy, that whole thing on in love relationships, my mind just went in a completely different way there, because it's like look for my upcoming podcast episode on how to delegate all the housework to your spouse or something like that. I'm just messing to your partner. That's so good, Alyssa. That's so good.
Oh, thank you.
Daniel, can I chime in with one thing that Alyssa said about 5 minutes ago, and
Sure.
then let's go to your story. If that's,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your story around delegation and micromanagement. But Alyssa, you talked about when you could no longer hold on, and it wasn't up to you, but you had to release, right? And it just reminded me of this. It's a really important pivot point in Brooklyn Music Factory's history, which I've talked a tiny bit about on the pod, but probably not a lot, which is, I have a congenital heart condition. And so I've actually had open heart surgery now 2 times, and I've had a valve replacement 3 times. And my first surgery was when I was 3, right? So I was mini. And then my mom always told me, you're fine for the rest of your life. That was the message I always got. Daniel, you know this story. But then in 2015, I went in for a regular checkup, and the cardiologist was like, Nate, we have an issue. You actually need open heart surgery, and you need it like yesterday. And so there I was. We were 5 years into the factory, and we had just begun to develop team, kinda. And we had just begun to delegate in some ways. But that was my equivalent of being forced to let go, because I went off the grid for a solid 2 months. Like there was no Nate, and what was fascinating was I can vividly remember meeting with the team, with all the teachers, plus our like 1 or 2 staff, and being like, so I have some news and I trust you all, and I really appreciate you giving me the space and time to heal. And it was powerful, Alyssa, because I came back 2 months later, and actually the business had grown like 5%.
No, that's amazing.
And it was like, I'm telling you, Alyssa, I was like, if you want to develop faith in delegation and begin, like, I didn't know how not to micromanage at that point. I just didn't even have a choice not to micromanage. But that's like we obviously, I don't wish any one of our listeners that type of medical emergency that requires you to delegate and let go. But we all actually do have very personal versions of this that resonate for us. And I just wanted to share that story because I love your like really stellar personal and practical example. But I would ask all of our listeners to not just treat your story as like, oh, isn't that interesting? But no, to actually think, when have you been forced to let go? Yeah, so
wow.
I wanted to share that.
Yeah, wow. I kind of want to end the episode on that, but I know we got to come over to me.
No, dude, let's hear your story, and then we'll. I mean, one of us three will come up with yet another great close. I don't know.
Oh, sure.
This episode is sponsored by BigMusicGames.com. As our listeners know, Brooklyn Music Factory is all about a fun, fluency-first approach to music lessons. And at the foundation of our teaching methods are rhythm, melody, harmony, and songwriting games that challenge students as young as 4 years old to train their ears and flex that musical mind. Because when you set an intention of gamifying every single lesson, you're going to find improved attendance, increased play at home, and higher student retention. So we've set up a website just for our listeners so you can start playing today. Go to bigmusicgames.com/7FMS and create your free account. Again, that's bigmusicgames.com/7FMS. And if you join today, I'm going to send you a personal invite to join our weekly teacher training call with me and Greggy Bizzle, our chief game designer. Go ahead and put play back into practice with Big Music Games.
Well, what's interesting is I've listened to you two, it's kind of reframed a little bit what I was going to say. Because what I'm beginning to realize in all three of our stories is that there was a certain inevitability to this happening because of the growth we were experiencing. And I didn't realize that that was going to be a common point between all three of our stories. And I would say that between the two of you, the question we've asked each person was, when did you make the conscious decision to delegate? And for me, that came at that growth point where I didn't have a choice anymore. I was out of time because I was running both my private studio, and it was the biggest it ever was. And then I was also running a rapidly growing consulting business and Grow Your Music Studio. And I got to this point, and this is the cliche, or a different cliche, not the one I mentioned at the outset of the episode, but there is that cliche of like you focus on your marketing and then it makes your business grow, and you spend a lot of time closing people and then delivering your service or product to people. And so you stop marketing because you're so busy doing that. And then that round of business kind of ends or starts to fade, and you're like, oh man, the business is shrinking. I gotta market again. And the whole time that you were delivering service and doing a good job with your product, you were thinking about marketing, but you just didn't have time. And if you actually go back and look at Grow in the first 2 years, you'll see I do this flurry of blog posts or videos, and then I didn't publish anything for like 3 months or 6 months. And then boom, a bunch of blog posts and videos because I got time again, and it was at a certain point that I just threw in the towel, so to speak, at trying to do everything and started to hire aggressively. I actually, within my story, want to kind of fold in the lessons I learned, so to speak, because I think people might be able to resonate with this. And so there are some takeaways that I would give people, and I'm going to inject them into the story kind of as I tell it. And it's this, that I actually consciously tried to grow my business in such a way that I didn't need other people. And this started right as I graduated college. It's the whole reason I went into group lessons. I was looking at the models available to me to make the kind of money I wanted. And I was like, I don't want to deal with staff. Let's just do group lessons. So, and I've said this on multiple podcasts in the past when I've talked about Piano Express, or I talked about my former group model. But for me to be able to take home more money after expenses than people who had schools that had revenue 5 times my size, because my margins were absolutely insane. To me, that was a huge win. Now, here's the deal. What I'm not explicitly saying to everyone in the audience is like, oh, do it Daniel's way, just be a solo teacher, have this really powerful group program. If that's the way you want to go, let me tell you, it's a very satisfying way to do things. It really is. There will be an upper cap with your time in terms of how much you can make. And so if you do have very big aspirations, then maybe that isn't the structure for you. But I know plenty of teachers who studied under me or grouplessons.com that their plan is to be a solo teacher and to make, well over what the industry average is for a music teacher and delivering a great educational product at the same time. Great. More power to you. Mm-hmm. But what I will say is that even if your aspiration is to build a massive school, you have the opportunity to be absolutely as efficient as possible as you do it. And so that looks like really having your eye on the ball, really having your eye on the numbers, all that sort of thing. And at a certain point, and this is, Nate, I know we did that episode on the hiring order, but if you remember, actually, my first hire was not the financial wing. My first hire was basically an executive assistant, but what I gave her was a lot of financial tasks that I was doing. That's what it was. So I did hand off financials at first, but it wasn't to an official financial wing person. It was just my admin doing a lot of financial stuff for me. She was 23 years old, handed it off to her. Trust wasn't my issue. It just wasn't. And this is where I kind of go into the second takeaway that I would tell people here. And, this could just be a quirk of my personality, but what I would really say is prep before you're ready. All right. And on this podcast, we did talk about this book. We did a whole podcast episode on The Great CEO Within. And I'm going to have Bethany put in the show notes whatever episode that was, because I can't remember off the top of my head. Nate's probably pulling it up right now. He's going to say, he just gave the horns of rock to me. But books like this will help you to start thinking that way even before you do that. And I'm just going to name drop something here, but I bought this course in 2013 or 2014 from, I think, one of the people that has most influenced my online business career. And I've mentioned it before, but it's Eben Pagan. I've never met him in person, but I've taken a lot of his courses. And I took his summit called Get Altitude. And it was basically, after he retired, he threw this I guess he wasn't retired if he was throwing this conference, but he basically, to go, I didn't go live. I bought it later at a much discounted rate. But if you went live, it was $10,000 a seat, and he had 500 people come and learn from him. It was his retirement gift to the industry, where he basically showed how he built 10 online brands in the early 2000s, mind you, 10 online brands to over 10 million in sales each. And 2 of them, he built over 50 million in sales each. And he basically said, my kind of going away party for the industry, because I'm retiring essentially, is I'm going to show you how I did it. And so I bought this summit, and I hadn't even started an online business yet. I was aspiring to do it. I was kind of dabbling with it, playing around with it. My studio was doing pretty well. This was after I'd started Google Ads. I started having these aspirations for really growing the group program. And I watched this summit over and over and over again. And a huge part of that summit was where he talked about how he hired what he called star players. hire star players and get them to run your systems.
Mm-hmm.
You monitor the players, they monitor the systems, was essentially, and he did this whole thing on how they did that. And he had tons of people working for him. That was such a powerful impression. Books like this was such a powerful impression. So when it came time for me to actually do the delegation, I actually really did have a lot of faith in myself that I could do it correctly and that other people could do it. Here's where my fear was. My fear was that I just didn't know enough to do it right. I didn't necessarily have doubts that other people could do it, because I had this great example in him, because I'd taken this summit from him like 5 years before that I actually really started to delegate and scale up my own businesses. My fear was just like, oh, I'm going to screw this up, or like, what are the micro steps involved in this? Like, I understand the overall framework, but like, how am I going to do this? This is where I hired a coach. And even that coach had someone working for him. She was the head of HR at $1 billion corporation, and she was retired now. She was like in her 60s, I think. And he hired her to run his, like, part of the coaching part of his business, to coach people who were starting to scale up their businesses. What a great mentor to have. Mm-hmm. And so they really taught me through the nitty gritty detail of really how to delegate, and just to be there for me when I ran into like all these inevitably like fiddly little questions, and I always overthink things, and they put up with me asking all these ridiculous, like, I micromanaged them. I didn't micromanage my people. Like, I was coming to them with just the most particular stupid little questions. But they were so gracious in, answering those. And what I would just say is that, in the coaching work that all three of us do, this is the kind of stuff that we deal with people all the time, is like mm-hmm. these fine points, these particularities of, scaling up the business. It's what we do in the Accelerator. It's what we're going to be doing in the Founders Forum, just at different scales. And I would just say that those are kind of the two takeaways that I would give to people. Like, mm-hmm. prep before you're ready, and just kind of understand that. I have a third one, but I realize I'm kind of becoming self-aware that I've been talking for a long time now. Like, I'm sure you guys have stuff that you want to jump in with, observations, maybe questions for me, pushback. I don't know.
Yeah. I just wanted to say one thing really quickly too, Daniel, and this would probably be a jump off to another podcast. So I'll be careful in the way I say this, but something that didn't come up with Nate and I mean, maybe a little bit, but something that really came out in your story is the quality of the hire really matters, because you hire for somebody who can be trusted to manage complex projects. And so, okay. I think you have this model. I know you've spoken about it before, where there's like different levels of employees, right? What was that again?
The 5 levels of competence.
Yes. And I think this is a really cool framework for listeners to become aware of, because, depending on the evolution of our business, we may or may not have the resources to hire, stage 5 employees or whatever the best, mm-hmm. employees are. But there's some things we can test in our interviewing processes that could help us to understand someone's ability to think in these kinds of ways that are more trustworthy for more complex projects, ways in which we don't need to micromanage as fiercely, right? Because I do think that there is this line where if we mishire, we're setting ourselves up to have to micromanage in a certain way. So I just wanted to make a point that it is equally important, if we're going to give our trust to somebody, we wouldn't just like randomly trust a stranger who, had no credentials or who, so I think we need to make sure that we're also vetting the people that we're putting our trust in, and doing so we're hiring with that lens of what are the qualities of someone that can do the thing that I'm doing very well without me needing to micromanage. I don't know if that makes sense. But.
100%. And I will just even tack this on to what you said there. And that is, this is actually getting into what my third takeaway was going to be. I think a lot of people don't realize, I know I've said this on the podcast before, I'm going to reiterate this again because a lot of people forget it and we don't say it very often. I think people think it's all or nothing. I have made a habit, maybe even a bad habit, of hiring lower level people and shepherding them up into a higher level person. So literally hired Kirsten in 2018 as a part-time assistant at, probably a solid level 2 level of competence, borderline level 3. By the time she left earlier this year in 2024, after 6 years, almost to the month, 6 years of the month, she moved on. She was on the podcast in somewhere in the 90s, somewhere between episode 90 and 100, like early 90s, I think it was. And she was talking about how she built systems here. Great episode. Put that in the show notes. She was a true level 5. When we were designing the billing system for Piano Express, grouplessons.com, we literally left her alone to do it. And she was the liaison between this very complicated third-party billing system, our head developer who used to work at Google, and she was in the middle and designing and helping figure all this out. Now, she wasn't doing coding. That's what our coder was for. That's what our chief engineer was for. But like no one was managing her. She even picked the company that we used to do the billing systems. This is a true level 5. And if anyone's wondering what the levels of competence are, we have referenced it in past episodes, and we're definitely going to reference that in the Founders Forum. And I work with people that personally in coaching. So does Alyssa. So does Nate. That's one of those things where if you need help on this, just reach out to us. We'll connect you with the right person. But I do think it's important for people to realize you do not have to start, because as Alyssa said, you maybe don't have the resources to have level 5. That's where you scale. That's where you scale up and you start handing things off. And that's really the last thing that I want to talk about, climbing the 80-20 curve.
You figure out the business that you want to create, and then you figure out where you fit uniquely in the business, and then you delegate as much of the other stuff as possible. So in Daniel, your example, you fit uniquely in the business as what? The lead educator. So you were delegating outside of that role, because that was your zone of genius. You were like, I'm going to be actually the person who delivers on promise.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that we don't turn this episode into only if you're scaling, only if you're a Brooklyn Music, a 7-figure school with 20 teachers and 5 staff, is this relevant? No. Alyssa, you hit it on the head, and then Daniel's story is precise and very real. I'll give one book recommendation back to you, Daniel. Work the System was the first systems book that I ever actually read. Yeah, it's a good one. Sam Carpenter. He's good. There's like a whole website and all.
He just released the 5th edition in September of this year. He just rewrote the book. Yep, I got an email from him. Not personally. It was his email blast. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not sexy. It's not like the kind of read you're going to take to bed with you. It's just a really relevant reference manual. And I just am going to say back to Daniel, your point, and I'm picking it back to you, is that when I knew at the time that my version of systems, working procedures development wasn't actually, I didn't know you at the time, but now that I've seen yours, I knew they weren't going to be as thorough as like Daniel's are, right? So I needed a guide. And that became my guide. And I bought a copy for Kai, who became our director of operations in 2015, coming out of that open heart surgery I was talking about. He became our director of operations, and we just book clubbed the sucker. We just read it together. I know you guys are big proponents of that, but you don't have to be an expert in creating efficient systems. You just have to know that you need help.